Chapter 13. The Price of Many Voices. Dorian Pike told me a side might be a surviving fragment of a forgotten divine age combat discipline, and relief hit hard enough to feel like fear. He said it to her room as note of dust, lamp, oil, and oil burnings, with 3 over the end of his vegetable over the top of validator, rubbing to team of animals, and 2 over the top of the white on since dawn. Outside the narrow windows, Halcyon was bright and dry and offensively orderly. Inside, the room looked like an argument between a scholar and a burial pit, and Dorian stood in the middle of it with one ink-stained finger pressed to a broken line of old text. "I am not saying certainty," he said. "I am saying correspondence too strong to ignore." Lydia Mara sat on the far side of the table with one hand against her temple and the other holding down a curling rubbing sheet. She had removed the heavier court trim from her sleeves, which made her look less ceremonial and somehow more severe. The morning light caught the side of her face and left the rest unreadable. "Say it cleanly," she said. Dorian did not look at her. "I am saying the right label given to cross may be a degraded surviving administrative name for one branch function inside a much larger martial framework." He tapped the text again. "The framework is old, older than the present kingdom structures, older than the current temple classifications, likely divine age or derived from a late divine age inheritance that was only partially preserved." I stood opposite him with both hands braced on the edge of the table because sitting had begun to feel too passive for the shape the last 2 days were taking. The tablet lay between us, wrapped on 3 sides in cloth to protect the remaining carved face. The surviving heading strip still bore the broken phrase Dorian had read in the labyrinth. Many-voiced Marshall, the missing part after it had occupied too much of my sleep. I said, "You're saying a side wasn't meant to stand alone?" Dorian finally looked at me then. "Yes, just that. No drama, no reverence for the revelation, no attempt to soften it into a thing a frightened mind could swallow politely." Yes, the room went very still around the word, not because I had expected applause. I hadn't, but there had always been, under the work and under the obsession and under every ugly practical gain, a quieter pressure that never left entirely. What if the room and Halcyon had been right? What if they had laughed because the thing itself deserved laughter? What if I was only dragging usefulness out of trash because terror and repetition can make man half delusional? The answer had never mattered enough to stop me. It mattered now because Dorian's yes did not flatter me. It rearranged the insult. Lydia watched my face for half a second longer than comfort allows. "You suspected this already," she said. "I suspected pieces," Dorian replied. "The labyrinth tablet only made the fragments harder to bury. The skill name made it worse." He turned a page from one of the older indexes, a copy so brittle he handled it with more care than some men reserve for infants. "Modern registries love simplification. They classify for deployment, not understanding. The old technical term is broken in every surviving reference I found, but the subordinate notation appears repeatedly beside branch attachments, appended functions, secondary lines carried in conjunction with a primary act." He flicked the edge of the page once. In 3 later clerical copies, the phrase is rendered lazily as sideline, or simply aside. Lydia's expression changed by a degree. "A clerk's reduction. A clerk's reduction of a language he no longer understood," Dorian said. "Which is how civilizations maim inheritance while convincing themselves they are preserving it." I looked at the open index without seeing the script properly. All those days. The ritual hall. The pale word above my head. Aside. The laugh. Brent's amused contempt. Gareth looking away. The nobleman's scrap takes the scrap. My own mind trying to build value out of something the whole room had recognized faster than I had wanted to. A clerk's reduction. Not a joke by origin. A mutilated surviving label. I exhaled slowly and discovered too late that I had been holding air far too high in the chest. Lydia noticed first, because of course she did. "You need to breathe before your face makes Dorian think he's won an argument." He gave her a flat look. I usually know that without facial assistance. Still, he waited while I got the next breath under control. Relief did not come gently. It arrived as a hard clearing of ground under the feet, dangerous because ground can make a man want to run harder than sense allows. "So the skill is real," I said. Dorian's mouth tightened. "That sentence is beneath the standard of your own experience." I almost laughed. "Almost." "Yes," I said instead. "Fine. Then the skill is not only real, it belongs to something larger. That is better." Lydia let the rubbing sheet settle and said, "Then why preserve a fragment through this summoning rite instead of the whole system?" Dorian's eyes moved to the tablet. "Because preservation is not always intentional. Sometimes a rite survives longer than the people who built its logic. Sometimes a state keeps using a machine after forgetting what half the levers were for." He leaned over the table and indicated one broken branch label in the diagram with a knife tip he used as a pointer rather than a pen. "And sometimes institutions remember enough to preserve outputs while losing the grammar beneath them." The word grammar landed cleanly. That was what the last months had felt like from inside. Not power seeking a stronger shape. A fragment trying to infer grammar from scraps and repeated failure. I asked, then the summoning right can still pull pieces of the old system. Possibly, Dorian said. Or possibly the right can only assign surviving residues according to current understanding, which would be worse. Lydia looked up. Worse how? Because then the kingdom has been distributing fragments of a dead martial language as isolated battlefield gifts without knowing what combinations, conditions, or costs they originally assumed. That silenced the room differently. Lydia's gaze sharpened at once, not toward me now, but toward the broader shape of the problem. She was too intelligent to stop at personal vindication when a system error larger than any one skill holder announced itself. Then or it may not. We do not know yet. He turned back to me. But yours does not collapse neatly. That is the point. Outside the window a bell marked the quarter hour in the temple district. The sound came thin through glass and distance. In the room, old paper and old stone answered with nothing at all. I looked down at the tablet again. Many-voiced Marshall, the broken heading now felt less like a mystery and more like an accusation against the present. Lydia said, "Show him." Dorian hesitated, not because he wished to protect me from knowledge, because he was ordering its sequence. Then he turned one more index toward me. The page was not a manual. That much was obvious even before I read the fragmentary heading translated into current script at the top by some dead archivist's hand, on the failure patterns of layered adherence in late war schools. My eyes moved downward. Even through the broken translation and Dorian's penciled corrections, the meaning came clear enough. Tremor of the hand after branch loading, persistence of false motion after exertion, double hearing, sight fracture at line transitions, pulse disharmony, limb refusal, speech lag, collapse under overcarried sequences. The relief in my chest changed shape, not vanished, sharpened into something colder. Lydia read my face again and said very quietly, "There it is." I lifted my eyes. "Those are symptoms." "Yes," Dorian said, "of the full system, of people attempting layered practice badly, quickly, incompletely, or beyond their stage." He folded his arms. "Which should concern you." That's an understatement. It is a functional understatement. I looked back at the page. Tremor, head pressure, visual blur, the strange auditory warping under deep strain in Calder's old chamber, the tingling in the right hand after repeated combined sets. I had written half of it down already as if writing symptoms in charcoal diminished their seriousness. Lydia stood and came around the table. Her voice, when she spoke next, had lost almost all its earlier cool amusement. "How many of those apply to you?" I should have lied. Instead I said, "Enough." Dorian muttered something that might have been a curse and might have been a prayer for lost competent archivists. Lydia's eyes stayed on me. "List them." I did not answer immediately, not out of pride, because saying them aloud changed them from obstacles to evidence. Dorian took mercy on no one. Hand tremor, head pressure, visual distortion under overextension, numbness after prolonged sequence attempts. He also reported spatial instability during the collapse under Calder. Lydia's gaze shifted slowly from me to him. "You know, I infer." He confirmed enough by failing to lie creatively. "I did not fail creatively." "No," Dorian said. "You failed conservatively." The line would have earned a better answer from me under different circumstances. Instead I asked, "How many of them died?" The room thinned. No one moved for a breath. Dorian answered because he never insulted a direct question by hiding in tone. More than the surviving records liked to count. Lydia closed the index with one hand, not hard, but enough to flatten the page and the moment together. Meaning the path is real, Dorian said, and the cost is also real. That was the point where everything reversed. Not the proof that my skill belonged to a real buried tradition. The reversal after it. Relief first, then exhilaration so sharp it almost felt like being forgiven. Then the deeper truth arriving behind both. The road was not only real, it was known to destroy those who took it badly, which left me with a choice too simple to dignify with language. Either the risk meant stop, or the risk meant I had finally found the honest name for what I was already doing. I heard my own voice say, "Then the issue isn't whether it kills, it's whether there's a correct way to survive it." Lydia looked at me the way one might look at a man who has answered a court sentence by asking for the sharper knife. Dorian did not look surprised. "No," he said, "the issue is whether enough of the correct way still exists to reconstruct before your body outruns its own right to continue." That landed cleanly because it was exact. He pulled 2 more pages from a stack and spread them beside the tablet. One showed line drawings copied from some older panel figures at different stages of motion with branch marks concentrated not at the weapon tip, but through the ribs, hips, and planted foot. The other was worse. Anatomical, in the limited way ancient martial diagrams sometimes are. Human outline, channel lines, notes at the hands, behind the eyes, along the spine. "This is from a later instructional fragment," Dorian said. likely already degraded from whatever original school text it copied. But the sequence is clear enough. Layering was not meant to be brute force through combat improvisation alone. I felt Lydia's attention on me without looking up. That is exactly what he's been doing, she said. Dorian tapped the page. Condition first. Breath regulation first. Structural carry first. Only then branch loading into offensive or defensive complexity. The old system treated the body as a conductor that had to be trained to carry multiple lines without cross noise. The term conductor meant little to current Aldervane military language, but enough to me. I understood immediately and hated how much sense it made. Too much meaning at once, I said. Yes, Dorian replied, or rather too much meaning poorly supported. The page beneath his finger held one copied note in later current script, maybe translated from worse surviving text generations ago. Do not let the body hear 3 commands where it has only learned to obey 1. I read it twice, then a third time, because it sounded like the most dangerous, concise description of my recent training anyone could have written if they knew me intimately and disliked me enough to be accurate. Lydia rested one hand lightly against the table edge. Is there a stage model? Dorian nodded once. Primitive. Incomplete. But yes. He lifted his chin toward me. Cross has likely forced himself from micro-additions into genuine dual-action functionality already. The Labyrinth Guardian fight showed carry linkage under stress. That is beyond the public description of his skill and dangerously ahead of his conditioning. Linkage, I repeated. He looked at me. One action setting the next. One action carrying branch consequence into the following action instead of ending as a mere appended effect. That phrase pulled straight into the center of the Valadrift fight. The mark on the Guardian's seam. The destabilizing cut feeding the next step. The slipped defense opening Owen's line. The sequence through the cracked ring when every small meaning attached to the next until the construct's own singular recovery broke under accumulated interference. I had felt it there before I had words. Now the words arrived and made the memory heavier. Lydia said, then he is further along than a fragment holder should be. Dorian's mouth turned grim. That sounds wrong. It is wrong. There was no comfort in the answer, only truth. I leaned forward over the table and looked again at the anatomical sheet. Behind the eyes, along the spine, at the hands, channel overload, reflex confusion, wrench echo. What happens if it gets worse? Dorian did not soften. You lose coordination first or lie to yourself about losing it. Then perception becomes unreliable under stress. Timing fractures. Motor signals blur. In severe cases, the body begins carrying residual command after the action has ended. He tapped one notation near the head. The old term here is difficult. It means something like aftermotion in the nerves. The body still hearing the previous line. Images rose too quickly. A sword cut that lingers in the arm after it has ended. A block reflex firing at empty air. Feet trying to complete a second step in the wrong direction because the first command has not cleared. Kara had called it pattern addiction from the healer's side. Dorian was naming the deeper mechanism from the dead school's side. I asked, can it be reversed? His silence answered before the words did. Sometimes, he said at last, early, if corrected. Not always. The records are poor because old war texts are better at producing excellence than preserving damaged men after excellence breaks. The room seemed colder all at once. Lydia crossed her arms and looked at the tablet rather than at me. So the current world specialized because specialization is cheaper to teach. That is one reason, Dorian said. Another is that if this system once existed in anything like full form, it would have demanded rare discipline, specific conditioning, and tolerance for an ugly attrition rate. Armies drift toward what can be scaled, and courts drift toward what can be ranked, she said. That line hung there because no one needed to explain further how the summoning hall had laughed at me for the same reason. A fragment that did not collapse neatly into one proud function looked like waste to a world addicted to obvious rank. I should have felt vindicated by then. Instead, I felt only the tightening inevitability of direction. Real path, real costs, real urgency. The three locked together too neatly for comfort. Dorian closed the failure index and straightened. I am telling you this now because ignorance would be worse, not because I expect the warning itself to stop you. He was right enough that I almost resented him for saying it aloud. Lydia did not bother pretending otherwise either. He won't stop, she said. No, Dorian agreed. Both of them looked at me then, not unkindly and not with any false awe. The gaze you give a man who has just learned his road exists and his mind all the way up. I said, then give me the sequence. Dorian's eyes narrowed. The parts that can be trained safely, or less unsafely. Breath first, structural carry first. You already said brute forcing the offensive branch is wrong. Fine. I heard the urgency in my own voice and worked to keep it from becoming uglier. Then tell me what the old order was. Lydia exhaled once through her nose. He asks like a starving man choosing which knife to swallow first. Dorian ignored her. For a long breath he looked like he might refuse on principle, or caution, or professional disgust for incomplete systems. Then he dragged a blank sheet toward us and began writing in quick hard strokes. You begin by ceasing all pointless improvisational depth work when alone, he said. That sounds like an order. It is the closest you will get to survival for me today. He wrote 3 headings down the left side of the page. First, regulated movement under breath. Second, contact lines that do not overburden the upper body. Third, post-action carry without branch multiplication. I looked at the headings. They sound simple. They are not. Lydia stepped closer to read it over his shoulder. Explain the second. Because his instinct is to solve every problem at the hands, Dorian said, not looking at me and still somehow striking exactly. But the old fragments repeatedly emphasize body-wide loading. If he tries to force linking through wrists and forearms without distributing through ribs, hips, and grounded recovery, the hands will fail first and lie about the failure until the eyes join them. I could feel the previous collapses under Calder and after the fog convoy slide into that sentence one by one. Wrist buzz, forearm numbness, head pressure following hand strain like lightning after heat. Lydia traced one gloved finger above the second heading without touching ink. Then he trains stance transitions and supports before aggressive layering. Yes, that will slow him. Yes, she looked at me. That was almost challenge and almost pity. Neither improved the room. Dorian went on. The old order seems to have treated breath not as separate conditioning but as line management, not relaxation, distribution, movement that also preserves internal structure. He made another note beneath the first heading, that part he has already stumbled into by necessity. Lydia's eyes flicked toward me with the faintest sharpening, which means his instincts are not entirely wrong. No, Dorian said, only expensive. I almost smiled despite the subject. Almost. He continued marking the page while speaking. Third, post-action carry. This is where you nearly ruined yourself in the old chamber under Calder and again after the convoy. You were trying to force the next meaning before the current action had settled. He underlined a word hard enough to nearly tear the paper. Carry is not multiplication. It is preservation. The action ends without ending wastefully. That was the cleanest way anyone had yet described what I had begun to feel in Valadrift before the Guardian fully woke. The next step reserved inside the current one. I leaned closer and said, show me on the body. Dorian looked offended that the request had arrived so fast. Lydia, unexpectedly, said, I can. Both of us turned to her. She set her gloves on the table. I'm not teaching his style, she said. I am showing line economy. There's a difference. No one argued with the practical value of it. So she moved the chairs aside and used the narrow records room floor, sunlight from the high windows cutting pale bars across the boards, while Dorian muttered corrections over her shoulder like a hostile tutor forced to admit the clutter needed another hand. Lydia chose the simplest demonstration possible, a forward-casting step stripped of magic. Advance, set the front foot, carry the body through without dumping the shoulders, then stop. Repeat. The first version was current doctrine, one clean act ending in full planted release. Efficient, obvious. The second, under Dorian's instructions and her own ruthless body intelligence, changed only by degrees and changed everything. The rear foot pushed without fully abandoning readiness. The ribs stayed lower. The shoulder line did not spend itself in completion. The finishing position already knew where the next adjustment would come from. See, Lydia said. I feel it, I answered before thinking. That earned me a quick look from Dorian. Then you are not entirely made of bad habits. Lydia reset and had me mirror the line. The first attempt looked acceptable and felt wrong. She told me exactly why. You finish into the floor like you're apologizing to it. That's no, that's what fear made of you. So again, rear foot. But, Terry, don't let the shoulders spend first. Let the next line remain possible. On the third repetition, something settled. Not a revelation. A small click of body logic. At the end of the step, I still possessed myself. That sounds obvious. It was not. Dorian heard the difference in my breath before he said, there. I held the posture for one heartbeat longer and understood at once why that was dangerous. Because even the stripped-down correction felt like food after hunger. Not enough. Enough to make the mind greedy. Lydia stepped back. Do not get excited. I'm not excited. She looked at me with merciless exactness. That is excitement arranged into discipline. The arrangement is not fooling anyone. I lowered the stance and admitted, fine. Dorian rolled the new sequence sheet once the basic demonstration ended and handed it to me. Those are the only things you trained today. I took the page. Yes, that sounds like a concession. It sounds like triage. The knock at the door came before I could answer. 3 short reps. Official. Dorian's face soured instantly. A palace courier entered with a sealed notice and bowed only enough to remain deniable if insults became necessary. Master Pite. Lady Marrow. Evan Cross. By order of the Military Review Office, a preliminary briefing has been advanced to tonight. Attendance required. Lydia extended a hand. Why advanced? The courier hesitated exactly long enough to confess there was more. Northern Pressure reports, my lady, and a second inquiry from Calder regarding reinforced engineering allocation. That changed the room. Dorian took the notice, broke the seal, scanned 3 lines, and swore softly. Lydia asked, what? He held the page out rather than answer it cleanly. I read over her shoulder. The wording was careful and ugly in the way official urgency always is when it wants to look composed. Escalation in frontier pressure. Need for timely assessment of recovered Marshall fragments. Evaluation requested of whether extant summon assets possess applicable correspondences. There it was. Royal urgency in bureaucratic dress. The moment a court smells weaponizable doctrine, it stops caring whether the knife still has blood on it from the last hand that held it. Lydia read the same line and said very softly, fast. Dorian folded the notice once. Yes, he did not need to say what fast meant. Faster pressure, faster interest, less room to learn safely before someone higher decided my body had become a battlefield problem to be solved by immediate use. The courier withdrew after receiving no answer except Dorian's silence, which likely frightened him more than refusal. When the door shut, the room felt smaller than before. Lydia put her gloves back on one finger at a time. They're going to ask whether he can be deployed against analogous targets. Yes, Dorian said. They're not entirely wrong to ask. No, he said. They're merely wrong to ask before the body keeping the answer has any margin. Her gaze moved to me. That did not help. I said, I'll tell them no if no is true. Dorian's laugh was brief and without warmth. You think truth governs rooms like that? It doesn't. The page in my hand suddenly felt very thin. Regulated movement under breath. Contact lines that do not overburden the upper body. Post-action carry without branch multiplication. The old order had survived as scraps. The capital was already asking how quickly scraps could be made useful. Lydia gathered her notes. I need an hour before the briefing if they expect coherent magical analysis. She looked at me once more. Do not train the exciting parts. That sounds like an order too. It is a better one than the court will give you tonight. Then she left, closing the records room door behind her with more care than the conversation deserved. Dorian stood at the table a moment longer, one hand flat against the wood. He looked suddenly older than he had in the labyrinth, perhaps because old stone can be argued with and institutions cannot. They will ask whether your skill corresponds, he said at last. It does. Yes. Then we answer that truthfully. He looked up sharply. Not fully. That irritated me enough to cut through the cold. What? Because correspondence is not competency, and competency is not survivable deployment. His voice stayed level, which made it land harder. If I say your path is real, they hear usable. If I say the costs are severe, they hear acceptable attrition so long as results come quickly enough. If I say the old system destroys the body when rushed, they ask whether it can be rushed carefully. That was so exact I could not answer it immediately. Dorian saw the silence and, for the first time all day, sounded almost tired rather than sharp. I am trying to keep the question alive long enough not to let it be eaten. I looked at the sheet in my hand again, then at the broken tablet, then at the window where Halcyon's polished lights touched nothing beneath the stone. I know, I said. He nodded once. Then listen to me now. If you intend to continue, and you do not mistake being right for being ready. The line carried Alden's shape in it, though Dorian would have hated the comparison. I tucked the sequence sheet into my coat and left the records room before staying there turned the walls into one more form of delay. Asterisk. By dusk the capital had already begun reshaping the day into formal language. Attendants moved through the annex corridors carrying seal bundles. Clerks crossed from records to review with the urgent gait of people who believe speed can substitute for courage. Lamps lit one by one along the balcony passages. Somewhere farther west the court musicians were beginning an evening exercise, and the faint orderly beauty of it made me want to put a fist through a decorative screen. I did not attend the preliminary briefing. Dorian did not ask me to. Whether from strategy, pity, or a correct assessment that my presence would only let the room start measuring deployment lines aloud, I could not say. Instead, he sent one short note through a page. Stay out of reach until I know what shape the questions have taken. That sounded less like advice and more like smuggling. I obeyed it for exactly 1 hour. Then I went to the rear training court behind the annex, the one not usually watched because the decorative trees around it made the space look less useful than it was. The court stones there were older, less polished, closer in feel to military use than the public yard where Garrett's white flare and Lydia's star geometry performed so well against clear air. I took no live blade, only a wooden practice sword and the sequence sheet folded in my belt. Do not train the exciting part, Lydia said. So I tried not to. That was the intention anyway. I started with the first line Dorian wrote. Regulated movement under breath. Luck to carry the ribs low. Do not let the shoulders spend the step. The difference from my earlier private training was immediate and infuriating. The structure improved. The body answered more coherently, but because it answered more coherently, I could also feel the temptation harder. Each corrected line whispered at the next branch hidden behind it. There, now, you understand more than you did this morning. Take one more attached meaning and see if the body holds. I did not. At first, I walked the cord under the lamps until the breath smoothing from a side came and sat properly under the movement, not as a lucky catch, but as a supported line. Then I shifted to contact work using the stone wall, palm to wall, rear foot drive, carry through, release without dumping into the hands. Then, the old dangerous pleasure returned as soon as the action began to feel less crude. Not madness in the loud sense, a narrowing, the body recognizing a road and wanting more of it because more finally seemed possible. I changed to the second heading, contact lines that do not overburden the upper body, short shieldless parries against the air, diagonal cuts ending in preserved stance rather than fully spent finish. Touch the wall, step away, turn, and keep the next line alive inside the current one. The work felt cleaner than anything I had done alone before. That was exactly why it was dangerous, because now I had a better grammar and the body wanted to start speaking sentences before the lungs and nerves had earned the right. I stopped. Read the sheet again. Third heading, post-action carry without branch multiplication. Not the exciting part. The term itself should have prevented stupidity. It did not. I began with the simplest pattern I could accept. Recover the step without adding a second offensive function. Just preserve the line. Then defend. Recover without attaching a strike. Then move, turn, breathe, settle. The court lamps hummed softly in their glass. Leaves stirred once in the trees beyond the low wall. Somewhere, far enough away to feel fictional, a page laughed in the corridor and was shushed by someone older. My body warmed, then heated, then moved past warmth into that dangerous suspended efficiency where fatigue hides its invoice and presence only usable function. The sequence sheet no longer needed reading. That should have been the warning. Instead it felt like permission. One more line. Just one. Not full branch multiplication. Only a test. Defend, and also preserve angle into the next step. No extra strike. No extra mark. Just carry with directional bias. That was not far beyond the rule. It was still beyond it. The first attempt failed cleanly. The second gave me a glimpse of it. The third caught. The block ended. The body retained the turned angle. The next step came easier because the defense had not merely finished. It had left a path. Exhilaration hit so hard I almost laughed aloud. There it was. The path was real. The old order real. The grammar real. And the body, when shown a fraction more correctly, answered faster than fear had ever allowed me to believe. That should have been enough for the night. It was not. I tried it again. And then, the line improved. Then began to cost. Not in obvious collapse. More subtle. A brightness at the edge of vision. Pulse climbing harder into the throat. The right hand beginning to buzz after a particularly clean preserved turn where the body wanted to attach still more meaning and I had to deny it late. I kept going. Because the high was cleaner now, not the blind compulsion from Calder's substructure or the desperate spite after the fog convoy report. This felt justified, supported, informed. That made it worse. The mind can forgive itself almost any excess if it believes the excess has finally become intelligent. I moved through the court, practiced sword whispering short lines through the evening air, and started building little chains despite the rule. Guard, slip, carry, cut, settle, preserve, step, breathe, turn, bias. Not full multiplication. Not quite. The body knew the lie even as the mind dressed it better. The nausea came suddenly. Not enough to double me over at first. Just a cold rolling shift under the ribs that did not match the amount of visible exertion. My sight narrowed on the far lamp. The edges of the court darkened. I stopped. I should have stopped. Instead I braced one hand against the wall, breathed low, and waited for the wave to pass so I could identify whether it was breath, food, or strain. It was strain. I knew that the moment the right hand tingled from palm to elbow and the left side of my jaw went tight for a heartbeat as if my face had briefly forgotten what line it was meant to hold. Not severe yet. That phrase surfaced automatically, the way men with bad habits reach first for the smallest interpretation that still lets them continue. I almost did continue. Then Nina Mercer said from the court entrance, "If you move one more time before answering me honestly, I will drag you to the temple wing by the ear." I turned too quickly and the court tilted around me. Only a degree. Enough that I had to reset the stance before the world finished moving. Nina had seen all of it. Of course she had. She stood in the archway with a treatment satchel over one shoulder and a white temple outer wrap unfastened at the throat as if she had come in haste or irritation or both. Evening light from the corridor behind her made the court beyond look softer than it was. Her face remained practical and unsparing as ever. Only the eyes had changed from the last time she confronted me. Less detached now, more decided. How long? She asked. Not long. That was your first lie. Don't stack them. I lowered the practice sword and admitted, I don't know. She walked into the court and closed the distance between us with no patience for Diggity's slower route. You're pale, I noticed. You're compensating in the left shoulder again. I said nothing. That means yes. She took my wrist before I could offer a useless protest and checked pulse with 2 fingers that felt offensively calm against the chaos under my skin. Her expression changed almost at once. You did it again. Did what? Trained until the body stopped reporting clearly, then used the fact it stopped reporting clearly as evidence you could continue. The line landed with enough precision that for one embarrassing second I could not tell whether Dorian had found time to brief her personally or whether healers simply develop shared methods of seeing through stupid men. Nina, no. She let go of the wrist only to take the practice sword from my hand and toss it onto the bench by the wall. Do not smooth this over because you finally got a prettier explanation for the damage. That phrase stopped me harder than the nausea had. A prettier explanation. Yes, she folded her arms and studied me with the expression of someone choosing exact language because sloppy language would let me escape through it. They told me enough, she said. Not the archives, not the report room. People talk around edges. Dorian Pike is angrier than subtlety likes, and Lydia Mero asks too many clean questions when she's interested. I do not need every page to understand the shape. I looked at her and realized there was one more turn in this conversation I had not accounted for. Nina was no longer merely the practical healer among the summoned who happened to notice social positioning faster than most. She had moved her footing, not into sentiment, into judgment. You think I'm wrong, I said. I think you are onto something real. Her voice stayed level. That is what makes this worse. The evening air seemed much colder suddenly. Nina stepped closer. When I first read your skill description, I thought the danger for you would be simple. Neglect, undertraining, being sent somewhere ugly with too little support because no one expected much. She held my gaze without flinching from the ugliness of saying it. Now, I think the danger is that the method may actually answer you. That was not what I had expected her to say. It unsettled me more than accusation would have. She went on before I could. I have seen healers in the temple wing ruin their own hands learning saint line restoration faster than the body allowed. I have seen channel specialists damage vision because they kept proving they could function one more week. Wrong methods do not always fail quickly. Sometimes they reward you just enough to drag you deeper. The nausea had eased into a hard knot under the sternum. My pulse still ran too fast. The tingling in the right hand had faded to a background thread. I said, Dorian already warned me. I'm not Dorian. Nina's mouth tightened. He warns from the dead texts outward. I'm warning from the living body inward. That, too, was exact. I leaned one shoulder against the wall because standing in the open suddenly seemed an unnecessary performance. I know the cost is real. She shook her head once. No, you know the words for the cost are real. Those are different things. I had no answer good enough to throw at that. Nina took the silence as permission to continue, which was a healer's vice and, in her case, usually a virtue. Tell me what happened. In the court? In your body? So I did. The corrected step under breath. The preserved line. The first clean carry into the next position. The exhilaration. The nausea. The narrowing at the court edge. The pulse climbing too high. The brief jaw tension. I left nothing out because she would only extract it again with more irritation if I tried. When I finished, she exhaled slowly through her nose. That is not ordinary overtraining. No, it is not ordinary magical fatigue either. No, it is a wrong interaction between growth and method. There it was, the answer coming from a different direction than I had imagined and landing harder for it. Nina looked at me very directly and said, your method is wrong in a dangerous way. The court went silent around the sentence. No bells now, no pages. Just leaves shifting once beyond the low wall and the slow burn of the lamp near the bench where she had thrown the practice sword. I heard myself ask, quieter than before, wrong how? She did not answer quickly because she was building the line carefully. Because you are teaching the body the effect faster than you are teaching it the structure that should carry the effect. Because every time the method works, you trust the working more instead of questioning the costs that bought it. Because you have started treating symptoms as proof of progress so long as the progress arrives first. She held up one finger between us, not in threat, just precision. And because the worst part is that it may still get you stronger. The sentence cut deeper than anything else that day. Not because it was cruel. Because it struck the exact place I had been hiding from all along. If the method were wholly wrong, it would fail cleanly. If the path were only safe, it would not demand this kind of decision. The true danger sat in the middle. The road answered. The answer cost. I looked away toward the bench where the practice sword lay across old wood in a cross of shadow and lamplight. So what do I do? Nina's expression shifted, only slightly. not softer, more serious, which on her face amounted to nearly the same thing. You stop training alone when the symptoms start changing quality. She started counting on her fingers. Not severity, quality, new numbness, new visual distortion, any speech lag, jaw tension again, sound splitting, any delay in hand response, a second finger. You tell someone every time, not after 3 days, not after a collapse, every time. Is sir, and you let me examine you when I ask without acting like dignity has a pulse. I almost smiled at that and did not quite manage it. She saw. You're still in there. That's reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. Of course it wasn't. She stepped to the bench, picked up the practice sword, and held it out to me. For one impossible second I thought she meant for me to resume. Instead, when I reached, she pulled it back half an inch and said, tomorrow. I let my hand fall. Tomorrow. Her eyes stayed on mine. Because if you keep training this tonight out of fear that the lion will vanish by dawn, then the fear is already running the method and you are too far inside it. That line pulled everything together. Alden's warning about rhythm, Tara's warning about pattern addiction, Dorian's warning about premature readiness, Nina now drawing the same truth from the body's side with no patience for romance. I nodded once, not because I was cured, because I recognized the wall and could not honestly pretend not to see it. Nina set the sword back on the bench instead of giving it to me. Good, she said. Then, after the briefest pause, that was not easy for you. No, that also isn't reassurance. I know. She adjusted the strap of the satchel and turned toward the archway. At the entrance she stopped and looked back once. The temple records on Saint Line damage mention one thing the dead martial texts probably won't, she said. That people on real paths are often the worst at admitting when the path has become the injury. Then she left Freddy in the court of the lamp, the bench, the precise sort of the read in force, and the cold excited chamber that thought under the ribs which sleep, but did not improve it. I stayed there a long time without moving. Not because I lacked the strength to cross the court, because motion itself had stopped feeling simple by the end of the day. The path was real, the cost was real, the method was wrong in a dangerous way, and the worst part Nina was right was that it was still working. Chapter 14. Brilliant alone in the war room, each of us was impressive for about 30 seconds. After that, the cracks started showing. The chamber was long, high-ceilinged, and built to make maps feel more important than blood. Halcyon liked its strategy rooms the way it liked its reports. Clean lines, polished surfaces, clear labels, enough distance from the actual dead that a man could still believe war obeyed arrangement. A broad table occupied the center, layered with relief maps, movable ridge markers, colored pins for supply lines, and carved blocks representing fortifications, reserve companies, mage batteries, and summoned assets. We were the summoned assets. It had been 2 days since Dorian Pike laid the old fragments out in front of me and gave my humiliating skill a lineage instead of an apology. 2 days since Nina Mercer told me my method was wrong in a dangerous way and made the warning land harder than any blade had. In those same 2 days, the capital had discovered exactly what Dorian predicted it would discover. Once a court smells a useful doctrine in buried stone, it loses patience faster than caution. So we were here, not because the kingdom trusted us equally. That was a fantasy for stories told by people who had never watched a room's sword value before the chairs were warm. We were here because the court wanted to see how much frontier pressure and recovered fragments had altered the shape of its best living pieces. Gareth Voss stood nearest the table's north edge, broad-shouldered and upright, one hand resting on the pommel of a practice blade as if the room itself would make more sense if a sword were available for punctuation. Lydia Mara had taken position to the left, where the mage side notation sheets and arcane topography overlays had been placed almost unconsciously in her reach before anyone admitted that was what they were doing. Owen Red leaned against nothing and still looked as if he were one impatient breath from leaving. Brent Haver planted himself in the only space wide enough to make his stance look natural. Mila Hart stood near the rear corner of the table with spirit weave feigned around 2 fingers, not active enough to draw rebuke and not inactive enough to be accidental. Nina stood beside the medical supply estimates with the air of someone who had not chosen that spot, but understood too much to vacate it. And me, I stood where rooms like this put men whose presence they could not fully justify, but no longer found easy to exclude. Not at the center, not fully outside it either. That alone said enough. A cluster of officers lined the walls, some military, some court, one temple observer pretending his presence was about morale rather than influence. Dorian Pike remained near the record stand, expression permanently halfway between contempt and hunger. He had won enough argument to get me into the room, though not enough to make anyone comfortable about it. The session began with a scenario board. Simulated northern lion stress, said General Corrin, a lean man with iron hair and the sort of clipped voice that sounded like orders even when it asked for water. 3-point pressure on the high ridge forts, supply interference in the eastern lanes, abyssal scout disruption, possible breach attempt toward the Calder corridor, though not necessarily at Calder itself. That last phrase flicked through the room and did not settle. Some of us heard more in it than others. Corin placed black markers along the northern edge of the relief map. Objective: stabilize the line over 48 hours without sacrificing Central Reserve integrity. Gareth answered first, of course. Break their advanced spear, he said. He reached across the table and set his hand near the largest of the Black Ridge markers. If the enemy pressure is organized at 3 points, one of them is the actual thrust. Hit the real spearhead hard enough and the flanking pressure loses nerve. One of the captains along the wall nodded immediately. Fleeing, aggressive, heroic in the exact way the capital understood on sight. Lydia spoke before the nod finished. That assumes the thrust is materially dependent on ordinary morale logic. She moved a white marker from the Central Reserve to a higher elevation line east of Gareth's chosen point. Long-range suppression is safer. Force the pressure fronts to redistribute under incomplete information, then isolate the true breach through observation and resource denial. Also clean, also brilliant, also different. Brent tapped the table with one thick finger. Both of you are gambling on early ray accuracy. He shoved a fortification block inward and anchored it with a second token. You harden the central ridge and let them break themselves on it. Then you counter once their best line spends itself. Owen exhaled through his nose. That gives scouts too much freedom in the lanes. Then kill the scouts. I would, Owen said, until your hardened central line blocked every efficient approach and forced my return path through congested support traffic. Brent opened his mouth. Lydia cut in before the argument could grow comfortable. And if I commit suppression fire from this angle while Voss drives a breakthrough and Red runs lane interception, I lose safe casting lanes every time the line bends inward under counter pressure. Then don't cast into my line, Gareth said. Don't stand in mine, she replied. For a few breaths, it still looked like strength. That was the first crack in the old certainty made visible. Each answer, standing alone, was excellent. Gareth's solution was the answer of a man built to cut certainty into battle. Lydia's was the answer of a strategist who trusted distance and controlled fire more than impulse. Brent's was the answer of an anchor. Owen's the answer of a blade that lived in motion and punished inefficiency. Nina waited until the men had marked half the map with their own confidence. Where are your wounded moving? She asked. No one answered quickly, because it was not a glamorous question. She lifted 2 red counters from the reserve tray and placed them behind Brent's hardened central line. Any stabilized front still bleeds. If you concentrate too hard here and your support corridors narrow, I either overcommit temple resources into fixed lanes that scouts can target, or your casualty rotation slows enough to make morale collapse arrive from the rear instead of the front. That put an unpleasant layer under Brent's clean wall. Mila spoke only after that. If the lines keep crossing each other this tightly, she said quietly, then any barrier or detection net that I weave across the ridge channels gets shredded by Allied interference before it matters against the enemy. General Corin watched all of it with his hands clasped behind his back. The officers around the wall watched more carefully than they pretended. No one interrupted because watching specialists collide is often more educational than listening to them agree. Dorian, from the back, said nothing at all. That was how I knew he was enjoying the room's discomfort. Corin shifted one of the black markers farther east. Fine, he said. Reform the response under constrained sight, incomplete communications, and variable terrain. Assume the pressure does not arrive politely. That sharpened the exercise. The relief map was not enough anymore. Assistants brought in weighted string, sight block screens, small elevation wedges, and the ugly practical tokens used in military planning when ideal lines have to pass through actual ground. Lydia's preferred fire arcs narrowed. Owen's clean run channels broke. Brent's anchored hold line became less central and more exposed. Gareth's breakthrough route now intersected support withdrawal at 2 points if the timing went wrong by even minutes. Minutes matter, especially when the people at the table are all used to getting their way through force of roll. I said nothing for a while. That was deliberate, not false humility. First, I could always either know because that way do. Second, unless the threatened is then up to his idiot. So I watched. Gareth mapped an assault window that depended on Lydia withholding major fire for the first phase. Lydia remapped support arcs that depended on Gareth delaying commitment by 3 minutes he had not agreed to lose. Owen found a fast interception pattern that required Brent not sealing the center too early. Brent preferred the seal because open center lines offended his entire philosophy of survival. Nina kept placing casualty and transport counters into spaces none of them wanted to leave clear. Mila adjusted barrier threads and observation bands across the map, then kept withdrawing them because every other elegant answer passed through her space without making room for it. Brilliant alone, unstable together. The room was showing it by inches now. The generals saw it too, though not all of them liked how visible it had become. One older commander near the west wall murmured to another, "They are extraordinary." The other replied, "Yes, that is not the same as interoperable." Interoperable. There was a capital word for what I had been feeling in dirt and blood for weeks. I hated it on principle and kept it anyway. Corin called for a practical projection after that. The war table had a built-in magical overlay system, old enough to be mechanical at heart and refined enough by the court mages to look elegant. Lydia, with visible reluctance, gave enough structured energy to bring the terrain grid alive. Pale lines ran along the relief map. Color phantoms marked unit movement according to each proposed timing sequence. The room dimmed automatically to make the projection clearer. That was when the cracks stopped being conversational. Gareth's breakthrough route, taken at his preferred timing, hit the enemy spearhead exactly as designed and looked magnificent for 6 breaths of projection time. Then Lydia's delayed suppression arcs lost angle and left an eastern scout lane open. Owen's projected intercept solved the scout lane and created a traffic collision with Nina's wounded evacuation route. Brent's central hardening reduced one collapse and caused another because the rear supply line, forced too tight, became easier to choke than the original broad front. Mila's barriers lasted longest in the simulation when everyone else treated them like fixed weather. No one else did. Her threads repeatedly vanished under Allied assumptions, not enemy superiority. She watched the dissolving overlays with a face gone too still. There was the first disturbed perception, and I do not think anyone in the room except me noticed how much it cost her not to say more immediately. Corin reset the board and had them run it again. The second pass looked better, not because anyone had surrendered the shape of their own excellence, but because repeated embarrassment is a teacher even in polished rooms. Gareth delayed by a minute. Lydia shifted one fire line. Owen cut a scout path shorter. Brent widened one support gap he clearly disliked on moral grounds. Mila changed her barrier anchors to avoid the worst intersections. Individually, every alteration improved something. Collectively, it still failed. This time the failure came later and uglier. The line held through the first 12 minutes of projected pressure. Then an abyssal marker Corin had kept in reserve appeared on the left flank, not where any of the previous clean solutions had expected a serious answer. Gareth's commitment was too deep to pivot instantly. Lydia's fire arcs now wrist-friendly overlap with Owen's fast line. Brent's widened gap became exactly the entry point the flank pressure needed. Mila's barrier neck could have blunted the shift if it had been layered earlier across Allied movement timing instead of fixed to ground sectors. Could have. Did not. The phantom line collapsed elegantly. That was somehow worse than if it had burst. No one spoke right away when the projection failed. The dim room made faces harsher. Gareth's jaw tightened. Lydia's hand remained flat on the table edge, perfectly still. Brent looked like a man personally betrayed by geometry. Owen folded his arms and stared down at the broken line as if it had offended him by not being faster. Nina closed her eyes for one breath only. Mila's threads withdrew from the table entirely and vanished against her skin. I realized then that I was gripping the corner of a noteboard too hard, not because I enjoyed watching them fail, because the failure felt familiar in a way the room still did not understand. Alden had seen the line once in a damp infirmary after my first meaningful combat and said, "You did 2 things at once." Dorian had named it better later. Attached meanings. Carry through. Preservation of the next line. The projected war kept failing because everyone at the table was strong enough to make a primary action magnificent. Almost no one was structuring the second or third meaning that had to ride with it for the others to live inside the same battle. I did not think that in such clean terms then. I felt at first a deep irritation under the sternum. Not with them, with the shape of it. Corin noticed the silence lengthening and said, again. This time Lydia looked up. What? Because a line that breaks in 12 minutes breaks in one if the commander believes the first answer was enough. She held his gaze for half a second longer, then reset the projection. The third pass was the point where I made the mistake of understanding too much while still lacking the status to carry that understanding cleanly into the room. We ran the scenario again and again with altered timing and altered routes. Some things improved. The obvious conflicts got cleaner. The hidden ones surfaced. Gareth's power demanded room to complete itself. Lydia's demanded certainty of lane. Owen's demanded adaptable space and rapid support recognition. Brent's demanded stable access. Nina needed survivable corridors. Mila needed allied actions not to shred her work by indifference. No one was wrong. That was the problem. Wrong answers can be discarded. Correct answers that cannot coexist are harder. The pressure sharpened when Corin shifted from projected map to live movement. He ordered the central floor cleared and had the assistants lay simple ridge markers, support flags, and lane lines across the polished stone. Not a spar, not a full simulation, a timing drill using bodies instead of lights. Show me your first sequence at field speed, he said. No one could hide behind abstractions anymore. Gareth took the lead advance through the center lane. Lydia marked her cast point on the rear left arc. Owen set for flanking intercept. Brent held the anchor angle. Mila prepared a barrier detection weave across the notional support channel. Nina placed herself on casualty rotation line. I remained outside the first arrangement because no one yet knew what symbolic used to make of a side in a live doctrinal drill without making the whole exercise look like charity. Corin gave the signal. For 3 seconds it looked excellent. Gareth surged forward with the exact compact force that made him ideal for breaking a line before it knew how afraid it should be. Lydia's casting geometry unfolded behind him without wasted flair. Owen cut right and vanished into the flank path. Brent locked center. Mila's threads rose. Then the sequence died in the air between one movement and the next. Gareth's second step consumed the lane Lydia needed to complete the safest fire line. Lydia compensated, which shifted her geometry half at pace and forced Mila's barrier to split around it. Mila split the barrier, which left Owen's return path brushing the active thread edge. Owen compensated by cutting tighter around Brent's planted line, which narrowed Nina's evacuation corridor to almost nothing. Brent, seeing compression, instinctively hardened the center more. And there it was. Not one mistake. A chain of correct instincts colliding because each answer spent itself too completely in its own role. Stop, Corin snapped. The room froze. Gareth turned first, irritation already rising. We didn't finish the sequence. You finished enough of it. That should have ended there. It didn't. Because I had already seen the same pattern from 3 angles and by then the words were pressing too hard against the back of my teeth. Without thinking carefully enough to save myself, I said, the problem starts before the cast. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I hated the sudden stillness immediately, not because I regretted seeing it. Because speaking from the margin into the center always feels a little like stepping onto lake ice and hearing the first complaint under your own foot. General Corin did not rescue me. He only said, go on. So I did, because backing away after that would have been worse. Voss commits his second step as if the line belongs only to him, I said. Gareth's expression sharpened. Because it does in a breakthrough. No, Lydia said before I could. Not if I am behind the line and expected to preserve its depth. That bought me one more breath. I used it. Marrow adjusts to save the cast, but the adjustment steals Heart's clean barrier shape. Then Red's path cuts the only safe return. Bastion closes to protect the center because that's what it should do, and Mercer loses the wounded route. Brent frowned at me. You say that like it's a simple diagram. It isn't, I said. That's why it keeps collapsing. No one laughed. That mattered. Because a week earlier, maybe even 3 days earlier, the room would have let itself off the hook through my status. The useless leftover skill sees ghosts in officer drills. Easy dismissal. No now. Corin said, show it. I did not move at first. Garrett stared at me, not offended exactly. More unsettled. Show what? I walked into the lane he had occupied and took the first advanced step as he had. Not imitating his force, only the shape. Then I stopped before the second. If this step finishes like yours, the cast dies here. I pointed to Lydia's position. If you leave the line less fully spent, that weakens the breach, Gareth said. It preserves the next body, Lydia replied quietly. The room shifted at that. Not agreement. Not yet. First uncertainty. It crossed Gareth's face so quickly, I think only Mila and I fully saw it. Not self-doubt in his strength. Doubt that strength alone decided the structure correctly. I turned to Lydia next. If you move the cast point for safety after he commits fully, you force Heart to split and Red to narrow. Lydia's eyes narrowed. Then it has to be earlier, or his step has to preserve a second lane, she said. There it was. Not spoken in the old language. Spoken close enough. I looked at Mila. She had gone very quiet. The threads around her right hand had reappeared without her noticing and were trembling faintly in the air. You saw it too, I said. She flinched at being named, then nodded once. My weave keeps reading the others as interruption before it reads the enemy. That landed more heavily than any of my analysis because it came from the one person in the room whose function naturally listened to overlap. Owen spoke from the flank lane. The issue is timing debt. Everyone looked at him. He shrugged one shoulder. If I use the speed line to solve the scout route after the barrier splits, I pay for the split on the way back. That's why Mercer loses corridor. Brent grunted. That still doesn't solve the center. No, Owen said. It just proves the center isn't the only problem. Corin's mouth twitched very slightly, the closest he came to visible approval. Good, he said. Now you're speaking to one another instead of at the wall. The drill restarted. This time Gareth held the second step shorter and less complete, visibly hating the compromise. Lydia cast earlier, reducing the ideal strike power by a margin no one else in the room could have measured, and she probably felt like an insult. Mila anchored her barrier not to fixed ground, but to the expected movement gap Gareth preserved. Owen took the flank later and returned cleaner. Brent delayed the full seal by 1 count. Nina kept her casualty corridor. The sequence held longer, then failed again. Different place. Same truth. A right-side pressure marker entered and Gareth's shortened step, while better for the cast, now left his own kill line less decisive. Brent compensated by moving wider. That stole the exact reserve angle Mila needed to turn barrier into detection. The barrier held. The enemy did not vanish. Owen had to choose between chase and return. Nina lost the second corridor instead of the first. Lydia's earlier cast left her a fraction slower on the follow-through. The line didn't collapse this time. It frayed. That somehow looked more honest. The room remained silent after the second failure. Not humiliating silence. Working silence. Men and women adjusting their relationship to a truth they could no longer dismiss as personal friction or insufficient rehearsal. I felt something dangerous in that silence too. The first faint shape of an answer beyond mere criticism. Not yet an ability. Not even a plan. Only the outline of it. What if the gap between them could be thinned instead of each specialist rebuilt entirely? What if a step carried a little more room? A cast a cleaner timing? A barrier a steadier edge, a retreat line a preserved angle not by changing what each person was, but by adding a sliver of support inside the act itself. The thought arrived so suddenly it almost felt external. I kept my face blank because if I let it show too early, Dorian from across the room would read it and decide whether to fear or feed it before I had even named it for myself. Thin ally support. There it was, only as foreshadow. A shape without method. A dangerous maybe. Mila was looking at me oddly now, and I knew why. Not because she could hear the thought. Because Spirit Weave listens to strain and overlap, and somewhere in the last minutes my own attention had begun tracking not only bodies but the spaces where their actions failed to carry one another. It must have changed something in the way I watched the room. She said, very quietly, "You're doing it again." I turned slightly. Doing what? Looking at all of us like we're one problem. I had no good immediate answer. Corin saved me from needing one. Enough for the floor, he said. Back to the board. We returned to the table, but the room had altered. The specialists looked less like statues of their roles and more like expensive weapons discovering one another's bad angles. Gareth no longer spoke first every time. Lydia no longer assumed her range would be granted once named. Owen stopped pretending all timing problems could be solved through motion discipline alone. Brent still hated compromise but had started asking where it cost least. Mila contributed earlier now, sometimes before anyone else's answers sealed the wrong assumption over the space she needed. Nina became much more audible once the room finally admitted that living bodies have routes as binding as cavalry, and I became useful in a way that only increased my discomfort. Not because I was suddenly central. I wasn't. But because every time the projective line failed at a transition or the live drill exposed a second hidden debt, more eyes came to me before the room moved on. Not for command. For the invisible joints that sharpen inadequacy instead of easing it. Because seeing the break is not the same thing as fixing it. I could point to where Gareth's force lay needed room, where Lydia's cast timing died if unsupported, where Mila's weave got chewed by allied indifference, where Nina's corridors vanished, where Owen's return paid too much for his outward excellence. But if Corin had asked me then how to solve the whole thing in live war with current means, I would have had no answer worth the blood such certainty costs. Observation to urgency. Urgency to sharpened inadequacy. There was the shift, walking its ugly line. By late afternoon the room had moved from theoretical plan to assignment shapes. The capital, being the capital, still preferred to speak in categories men could wear on banners. Gareth as breakthrough asset, Lydia as strategic firepower, Owen as high-speed disruption, Brent as anchor, Nina as support triage, Mila as perception and barrier control, me as auxiliary irregular applicability, which sounded as insulting as it was meant not to. Corin read that last phrase aloud without emphasis. Dorian, from the rear, said, cowardly wording. The temple observer frowned. It is precise. It is evasive. Master Pike? No, Dorian said. You are all watching a fragment holder identify interoperability failures you did not notice on first projection, and the best phrase your excellent military language can produce is auxiliary irregular applicability. Corin did not rebuke him. That was more revealing than any agreement would have been. The general only said, do you have a better one? Dorian's eyes flicked toward me once, then to the map. Not one I'm willing to let your scribes own yet. That irritated half the room and satisfied none of it. The session might have gone on still longer, sinking deeper into the polite cruelty of institutions deciding how much of a person to convert into usable form if the runner had not arrived. He came hard through the west door, boots slipping once on polished stone because this room was built for plans, not mud or speed. His cloak carried road dust and the edge of sweat that means the message outran comfort by a wide margin. One sleeve had been resealed with fresh wax over broken wax, which meant the first authority had not been high enough and the message kept climbing. He stopped just inside, breathing once too hard for propriety. General Corin turned before the guards could decide whether to intercept. Report. The runner knelt and held up the dispatch tube. From the northern line, priority black. No one in the room pretended not to understand that color. Corin took the tube, broke the seal, and read. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative first. A room full of trained power measuring how much its next breath should cost. Then Corin read the first sentence aloud. Ridge Line Fort 3 fallen at dawn. No one moved. He kept reading. Outer batteries overrun. Secondary retreat line cut by singular hostile entity leading abyssal pressure. Singular hostile entity. The phrase went through the room differently than the others had. Lydia straightened first. Owen's arms came down from his chest. Brent pushed away from the table as if he already wanted wider footing. Nina's face emptied into healer focus. Mila's threads rose around her hand without permission. Corin read the final lines in a voice gone flatter than before. Survivor statements concur on one field commander among the abyssals. Extreme penetrative force. Line deletion at point of contact. Existing defenses failed in sequence. Northern Command requests immediate revision of all pressure assessments. Dorian took one step forward. What did they call it? Corin's eyes remained on the page. Then he said the name into the room like a blade being laid down. Vale Drakkar. It meant nothing to some of the officers. Not to the room's center. To me, the name landed without history and still felt heavy. An abyssal general. Not scouts. Not guided wolves. Not sabotage teams and wedges and partial openings. A field commander. The room changed around that fact faster than any of our careful planning had. Maps became inadequate at once. Titles dimmed. All the lovely specialized answers we had been arranging over polished stone now seemed to stand a little apart from one another under a colder light, each still brilliant, each suddenly less sufficient alone than anyone wanted to admit. There it spoke first, but not with the old certainty. What does line deletion mean? The runner, still kneeling, answered because Corin had not yet stopped him. It means, my lord, that the survivors say he strikes once and the defense there ceases to be a line. No one had a clever reply to that. Not even Dorian. Corin rolled the dispatch close. All previous exercises are suspended. We reconvene at full military review in 1 hour. His gaze moved over us, not lingering, not sparing. Now the room stops playing at pressure. The officers began moving at once. Orders, fabis, map substitutions, messenger chains, temple requests, reserve estimates. The machine of Halcyon waking itself into a more expensive kind of attention. I remained where I was for one breath too long, looking down at the relief map still scattered with half-resolved lines from our failed coordination drills. Brilliant alone, unstable together. And now something from the north had appeared that did not sound like it would permit those flaws much time at all. Mila came to stand beside me without my noticing her approach. Her voice, when it came, was very low. I don't like the way the room feels. Neither did I. But what I said was, no. She looked toward the dispatch in Corin's hand, then back to the map, and the disturbed perception in her face had deepened into something harder to ignore. It's like everything just got narrower, she said. That was exactly right. Not because the options had vanished. Because the cost of being wrong with them had suddenly stepped into the world wearing a name. Across the room, Gareth stood very still with one hand flat on the table edge. Not uncertainty of courage. Something worse for a man like him. The first clear sign that even a perfect blade might meet a problem that would not care how bright the first cut looked. Lydia was already thinking 3 moves ahead and hating every one of them. Owen had gone cold in the way fast men do when they scent a line that might finally outrun pride. Brent looked angry because anger is easier to carry than fear when rooms are watching. Nina was counting future wounded behind her eyes. Dorian Pike was staring at the northern edge of the map as if the dead language in his papers had just stepped forward and chosen a mouth. I looked at the black markers, at the failed lines, at the untouched spaces between them where meaning had to be carried or men would die. Then I looked up as the bells of Halcyon began to ring the hour, clean and distant above a city that still did not know its next war had found a face.